Question number 1, it is talking about two shapes right here, and one of them is missing a side. Now these are similar figures, and if you remember when you have similar figures, if you have a missing side, what do you set up? You set up a proportion. So when you have a missing side, you set up a proportion. So the reason why we do that is because similar figures were their caps, which means they have what? Congruent angles and proportional sides. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're just going to highlight our corresponding sides. So we know that RE corresponds with what? XB. Even though it's not in the same side, this shape has turned this direction. And so we have to look at the way it's turned. If you look, 15 is the shortest side on this trapezoid over here. So over here, it's also going to be the shortest side. All right, and then what corresponds with RU? BA. If you look, RU is the only slant that's in the picture. So over here, BA is the only slant that's in the picture. And now we set up our proportion. So I set up my two lines. And if you remember, we put corresponding sides across from each other. And then we put same shape on top of each other. So what is the blue that is on the first shape? 18. What's on the same shape as 18? 15. What corresponds with 18? 26.4. And what corresponds with 15? X. Now what do? I cross multiply, so 18 gets multiplied by X, which gives me 18X equals 15 times 26.4. And what do you get when you do that? 4 times 5 is 20, so I write down a 0, carry my 2. 3 times 6 is 30, plus 2 is 32, so I write down a 2, carry my 3. 5 times 2 is 10, plus 3 is 13. I'm on my next row now, so I add another 0. 4 times 1 is 4. 1 times 6 is 6, and 1 times 2 is 2. Add it all together, that gives me 396, because I have one decimal place. So one decimal place here, which gives me 396. And then what do I do to both sides? I divide both sides by 18. So which one goes on the inside of the house? Why? Because it's on top, so we have 396 divided by 18. 18 doesn't go into 3. It does go into 39. It goes into it twice. I have 18 times 2. 8 times 2 is 16, so I write down a 6, carry my 1. 1 times 2 is 2, plus 1 is 3, so this right here gives me 36. Subtract, that gives me 3, bring down my 6. 18 goes into 36 twice. 18 times 2 is 36. Sorry. Subtract, and that gives me 0. So that gives me X equals 22. This one says to create a list of all possible outcomes when flipping a dime and a quarter. So let's talk about a quarter. We know a quarter has heads and it has tails. And then we talk about a dime. And a dime has heads and tails. So whenever I flip my quarter onto heads, my dime can also still get heads. And then if I flip my quarter on heads again, I can still also get tails. So both of those things are a possibility. Or if my quarter lands and gets tails, it can still get heads. And then what goes in that last space right there? Tails. So this right here is every possible thing that could happen if you flip a quarter and a dime after that. The next question says to create a tree diagram to show all possible black containers when when selecting a marble from a bag containing the black and white marbles and then flipping a coin. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write down my options that can happen if I draw a marble out of a bag. So what are my two marble options? Black and white. Now, if I pull out a black marble, what kind of result can I get when I flip my coin? I can either get heads or tails. What about if I pull a white marble out of the bag? What's the possibility if I flip a coin? I can get heads or tails. This one says to show all possible outcomes when spinning the spinner and rolling a number cube, use a tree diagram. So let's talk about what it means by number cube, because we're talking about the number cube and then we're talking about the spinner. A number cube is a dice, and a dice is a little cube that has 6 sides, each of them with dots on them. So since it has 6 sides, on a normal dice, if you're playing a board game, you would have the results 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Well, let's say you roll a dice and you get a 1. Well, after that, I spin my spinner, and there are 6 total different options here. I can get all 6 whenever I spin that spinner. So let's say I get a 1 when I roll the dice. I can still spin a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, or a 6. Or let's say I roll a 2. I can still get a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, or a 6. So I want you to finish this out. What do you get? Here are my options. I can get all of these. So if I roll a 3, I can get a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, or a 6 when I spin the spinner. If I get a 4 on the dice, I can spin a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, or a 6, and so on and so forth. Okay, let's talk about if you're building a sandwich. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to start by listing out our bread options. We already have wheat listed. So what do I need to put here? I need to put sourdough. Well, let's say you choose the wheat option. What kind of meat could you put on your sandwich? You could either choose turkey or you could choose ham. Then let's say you pick sourdough. What are your meat options if you pick sourdough? You can either get turkey or ham. And then let's say that you chose wheat bread, you had a turkey sandwich. What kind of cheese could you get? You can get Swiss or cheddar. Or let's say you got a wheat sandwich, you put ham on your sandwich. What kind of cheese could you get? You could still get Swiss or cheddar. So now I want you to go through and I want you to fill in the rest of them. You should have gotten something that looks like this. No matter which option you choose for bread, you can still choose turkey or ham. No matter which option you choose, turkey or ham, you could still get Swiss or cheddar cheese. All right, this one says Katie ran 2 3/4 miles 5 times last week. If she runs 3.5 miles 5 times this week, what is the total number of miles that Katie will run during these 2 weeks? So we have last week and the amount of miles she had last week, and we have this week and the amount of miles that she ran this week. Well, I know last week she ran 2 3/4 miles 5 times. So what would I do with 2 3/4 and 5? I would multiply those. The reason why I would multiply them is because let's say on Monday she ran 2 3/4. On Tuesday she ran 2 3/4. On Wednesday she ran 2 3/4. On Thursday she ran 2 3/4. And on Friday she ran 2 3/4. In order to figure out how much she ran altogether, I would do 2 3/4 times 5. Then for the next part it says if she runs 3.5 miles 5 times this week, what is the total number of miles? So what would I do with 3.5 and 5? I would multiply them, because on Monday she ran 3.5. On Tuesday she ran 3.5. On Wednesday she ran 3.5. On Thursday she ran 3.5. On Friday she ran 3.5. So I would add those all up together to see what I would get. So now, instead of using the fraction form, I'm going to turn these fractions into decimals. So I have 2 3/4. And to turn a fraction into a decimal, what do? I divide. So which one would go on the inside? 3. Why? Because it's on top. So 3 goes on the inside, 4 goes on the outside. 3 doesn't go into 4, so we put an X up there. And since I'm out of numbers, what do? I add a decimal, and I add a 0. 4 goes into 30 how many times? 7. 4 times 7 is 28. subtract, that gives me 2. I'm out of numbers again, so what do? I add a 0, drop it down. How many times does 4 go into 20? 5. So this is 2.75. Then she runs 3.5 miles. Well, let's turn that into a fraction. Into a decimal. How do I turn a fraction into a decimal? I divide. Which one goes on the inside of the house? 1. Why? Because it's on top. So 1 goes on the inside, 2 goes on the outside. 2 doesn't go into 1. And since I'm out of numbers, what do? I add a decimal and a 0. How many times does 2 go into 10? 5. So that gives me 3.5. So how do I figure out how many total number of miles she ran last week? I'm going to do 2.75 times 5. And then how do I figure out how many miles she ran this week? I would do 3.5 times 5. Okay, I have 5 times 5, which is 25. So I have 5, carry my 2, 7 times 5 is 35, plus 2 is 37, so write down a 7, carry my 3. 5 times 2 is 10, 10 plus 3 is 13. How many decimal places do I have? 2. All right, then my next one I have 5 times 5, which is 25, so write down a 5, carry my 2. Then I have 5 times 3, which is 15, and 15 plus 2 is 17. So I have 1 decimal place because there's 1 decimal place right here. So I found out that last week she ran 13.75 miles. And this week she ran 17.5 miles. So how do I figure out how many total miles she ran? I add those two up together. So I have 13.75 plus 17.5. Now what do you have to remember every time you add with decimals? You have to remember to line up your decimals. I add a 0 right here, and then I have 5 plus 0, which is 5, 7 plus 5, which is 12, so I write down my 2, carry my 1. 1 plus 3 plus 7, which gives me 11, so I write down a 1, carry my 1. 1 plus 1, which is 3, and then I just drop my decimal straight down, so that gives me 31.25 miles. All right, and there's a lesson for today. If you have any questions, make sure you ask.